Imagine standing in front of a firing squad, waiting for the bullets to tear through your chest. That was the exact fate of Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceaușescu in 1989. Just days after losing power, he and his wife were dragged into a makeshift courtroom, convicted in minutes, and executed on live television. Now, look at the Nazi leadership in 1945. They were forced to stand trial before the entire world at Nuremberg. They were stripped of their ranks and hung from the gallows. This is the standard historical playbook for fallen tyrants. The world demands a reckoning. It demands blood, or at the very least, a lifetime behind bars. But on February 25, 1986, when the brutal dictator Ferdinand Marcos fled the Philippines, history broke its own rules. There was no firing squad. There were no handcuffs. There was no dark, damp prison cell. Instead, the United States military rolled out the red carpet. Marcos had been a vital anti-communist ally for Washington during the Cold War, and a personal friend of President Ronald Reagan. So, instead of facing justice, the dictator received an escape route. The U.S. military loaded Marcos, his wife Imelda, and 90 of their closest family members and loyalists onto two U.S. Air Force C-130 transport planes. They didn't fly them to a tribunal. They flew them to a luxurious, sun-drenched exile in Honolulu, Hawaii. Ferdinand Marcos spent his final years living in a massive estate on Makiki Heights. He spent his days sipping champagne, hosting international guests, and successfully ignoring every single attempt at extradition. In 1989, he died peacefully in a hospital bed, surrounded by his loved ones at the age of 72. His wife, Imelda, was later convicted of massive graft and sentenced to up to 24 years in prison. Yet, she never spent a single second inside a jail cell, not one night. And then, the ultimate plot twist happened in May 2022. Their son, Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr., won the Philippine presidency in a historic landslide, capturing over 31 million votes. The brutal fate never came. What the world witnessed wasn't the punishment of a corrupt dynasty. It was a calculated 36-year masterclass on how to loot a nation, escape justice, and walk right back into the royal palace through the front door. To understand how they pulled off the greatest political heist in human history, we have to look at the sheer scale of the crimes that should have triggered a lifetime of imprisonment. This wasn't just standard political corruption. This was an entire regime built on terror and systematic theft. During the 21 years of Marcos' rule, the regime signed a martial law decree in September 1972. This decree turned the country into a playground for state-sponsored violence. Human rights investigators have officially documented at least 3,257 extrajudicial killings. Think about that number. That is, thousands of citizens simply vanished, shot in back alleys, or dumped in shallow graves. Alongside the dead, there were 35,000 documented cases of horrific torture and over 70,000 political imprisonments. Anyone who spoke out against Ferdinand or Imelda was systematically crushed. But while the citizens were being terrorized, the Marcos family was shopping. The financial crimes committed by this dynasty are almost impossible to comprehend. When angry citizens and investigators finally breached the gates of Malacañang Palace in the days following the 1986 revolution, they expected to find a fortress. Instead, they found a monument to absolute greed. The image that shocked the world, the one that became a global symbol of political decadence, was Imelda Marcos's closet. Investigators cataloged at least 2,700 pairs of luxury designer shoes, bulletproof brassieres, hundreds of high-end European gowns. Millions of dollars in untagged jewelry were left behind in the rush to escape, but the shoes were just a distraction. They were a tiny, glittering ornament on top of a massive mountain of stolen wealth. Experts estimate that the Marcos family siphoned between $5 and $10 billion directly out of the Philippine economy. They didn't just hide cash in mattresses. They built a sophisticated global network of shell companies, dummy corporations, and secret Swiss bank foundations to wash the money clean. So, how does a family do this to their country and get away with it? Why did the Philippine case offer absolutely no justice compared to Romania or Nuremberg? The answer lies in a fatal mistake made during the 1986 People Power Revolution. The uprising that toppled Marcos is celebrated in history textbooks as a beautiful, bloodless miracle. And it was. Nuns literally knelt on the pavement before rolling tanks, holding nothing but rosaries. Soldiers refused to fire on their own people and defected by the thousands. When Corazon Aquino, the widow of the assassinated opposition leader Benigno Aquino Jr., took the stage to assume the presidency, she made a profound moral choice. She chose national reconciliation over bloody revenge. But in the brutal theater of geopolitics, that moral high ground carried a devastating price tag. Because the transition was so peaceful, there was no revolutionary purge. The old bureaucracy remained completely intact. The judges, the military commanders, and the regional politicians who had grown rich under Marcos kept their positions. Most importantly, there was no constitutional ban passed to bar the Marcos family from future political office. Look at post-war Germany. The denazification laws made it strictly illegal for former Nazi officials to run for power. In the former Eastern Bloc, lustration laws blocked old communist elites from holding office. The Philippines did none of this. They left the door wide open. Just 5 years after fleeing the country in disgrace, Imelda Marcos and her children were officially permitted to return to the Philippines in November 1991. The government thought they were bringing them back to face the music in civil court. They thought the legal system would handle them. They were dead wrong. The Marcos family didn't return in chains. They arrived with billions of dollars still hidden in offshore accounts, ready to exploit the legal system. They faced dozens of graft charges, not as terrified criminals, but as ordinary defendants with unlimited legal budgets. They were completely free to travel, free to run for office, and free to rebuild their political networks in their old strongholds, like the province of Ilocos Norte, where loyalist networks had been waiting for their return. On paper, the newly formed republic tried to fight back. President Aquino's very first executive order established the Presidential Commission on Good Government. This elite agency was tasked with one job: hunt down the stolen Marcos billions across Switzerland, the United States, and various Caribbean tax havens. To give them credit, they fought hard. Over the next 3 decades, the commission managed to recover more than $3.4 billion in cash, real estate, and stolen artwork. In 1995, a U.S. federal jury in Honolulu even awarded a historic $2 billion in compensatory damages to 10,000 Filipino victims of torture and disappearance. The court ordered this to be paid directly from the Marcos estate. The legal net looked incredibly strong, but the actual enforcement of these laws turned into a multi-decade joke. In September 1993, a Philippine trial court actually found Imelda Marcos guilty of massive graft. They sentenced her to 18 to 24 years in prison. The crowd cheered. Justice had won. Except she never spent a single night behind bars. Not one. Her high-priced lawyers immediately appealed the verdict, allowing her to stay out on bail. She lived in her luxury penthouse, attended elite galas, and ran for public office while technically a convicted felon. In October 1998, the Supreme Court completely overturned her conviction. Fast forward to November 2018. Another anti-graft court found her guilty on 7 counts of corruption for funneling $200 million into Swiss foundations during the 1970s. Once again, the media swarmed. Once again, she paid a small bail fee, walked out of the courtroom, and remained entirely free while the appeal dragged on for years. Meanwhile, what happened to the victims? The official Human Rights Claims Board eventually recognized over 11,000 victims of the regime. But partial compensation didn't even begin until the year 2012, drawn entirely from a single recovered Swiss bank account containing $246 million. True justice arrived in tiny, pathetic fragments, decades too late. And it never, ever included a prison sentence for the perpetrators. With the legal system effectively neutralized, the family began the final phase of their plan: the total rehabilitation of their brand. This wasn't an accident. It was a slow, institutional embrace by the Philippine state. The turning point came in November 2016. The controversial President Rodrigo Duterte officially approved an order to bury the preserved body of Ferdinand Marcos in the Heroes Cemetery in Manila. For decades, the dictator's embalmed corpse had been kept on display in a glass coffin in his home province, a bizarre tourist attraction. Now, he was being interred with full military honors alongside the country's greatest statesmen and soldiers. Protesters flooded the streets of Manila, burning effigies. But the message from the state was loud and clear. The dictator was now a hero. From that moment on, the political resurrection shifted into hyperdrive. Imelda Marcos successfully served 3 separate terms in Congress. Her daughter, Imee Marcos, won a powerful seat in the Senate. But the masterpiece of this multi-decade operation was completed on May 9, 2022. Ferdinand Marcos Jr., known to everyone as Bongbong, won the presidency by the largest margin in the country's modern history. He doubled the vote count of his closest opponent. How did he achieve such an absolute landslide? It was a masterclass in political engineering. Bongbong formed a massive alliance with Sara Duterte, the daughter of the outgoing, highly popular president. By combining the powerful loyalist networks of the Marcos family in the north with the massive Duterte base in the south, the dynasty created an unstoppable political juggernaut. International observers and Western journalists were completely stunned. How could a nation elect the son of the man who ruined them? The answer was hiding in plain sight, right on the screens of millions of smartphones. While the elderly survivors of martial law were passing away, taking their first-hand trauma with them to the grave, the Marcos family was executing a brilliant, decade-long digital memory war. They poured millions into optimizing algorithms across Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok. They didn't deny the past. They rewrote it. They targeted young voters who had absolutely no personal memory of the 1970s. Through highly produced, short-form videos with catchy music and cinematic filters, they completely reframed the brutal martial law years. The dictatorship was transformed into a mythical golden age of low crime, cheap rice, and national pride. The massive foreign debts that crashed the economy were rebranded as a visionary infrastructure boom. When old torture survivors tried to post their testimonies, they were systematically drowned out by millions of automated bots, paid influencers, and curated nostalgia content. The strategy worked perfectly. By the time the election rolled around, the historical truth had been entirely replaced by a digital simulation. The son of the man who fled the country in disgrace walked back into Malacañang Palace. He took his seat at the exact same desk where his father once signed the decrees of martial law. For audiences in the West, who are accustomed to clear post-dictatorship transitions, this entire trajectory feels deeply unsettling. German and Austrian political scholars are now actively citing the Philippine case in academic journals and policy briefings. It has become the ultimate warning sign for modern democracies. It proves just how terrifyingly fast collective memory dissolves when economic frustration meets highly coordinated social media manipulation. All of the protective shields that saved European democracies after World War II were entirely absent in Manila after 1986. There was no deep foreign occupation. There was no forced, systemic denazification. There was no intense generational education in schools, and no immediate legal accountability. What replaced them was a toxic combination: forgiveness without truth, financial recovery without punishment, and free elections without ethical boundaries. The brutal fate that the 1986 revolution promised was never suffered by the Marcos dynasty. It was suffered by the very principle of political accountability. 3,257 documented murders produced exactly 0 days of jail time for the family that ordered them. The lesson of this story is both simple and terrifying for every democracy on earth. Any nation that refuses to punish its tyrants is actively inviting their return. If you confront a fallen regime with polite forgiveness instead of strict legal justice, you inherit a ticking time bomb. You guarantee that eventually the children of the accused will return, legitimately elected, to reclaim the very palace their parents plundered. The Marcos family didn't endure a brutal fate. They simply outlasted it. And somewhere out there right now, another political dynasty is studying their playbook, waiting for their turn.